Brew Strong is brought to you by Blickman Engineering, home of the Riptide. Visit them online at blickmanengineering.com.
Brewers, it's time for the beer radio you've been looking for. This is the show that dispels myths, tackles the toughest topics, and makes no apologies for geeking out on beer. Hosted by two guys that drink before they think, Jamil and John Palmer. This is Brew Strong.
Hey, howdy, hey, my brewing brothers and sisters.
Greetings, Cretans. Good to see you all again.
Right. We're back for another round of Brew Strong. And I tell you, it has been an interesting shift going over to Zoom for these shows. You know, John, he's now taking the opportunity to go sit in a hop field. Apparently, he's got hops like year round that are always green and ready to go. And I think, you know, in the hop field, he's not got good internet connectivity because I think we've lost John, unfortunately. But what I will say is what we haven't lost is our fine sponsor, Blickman Engineering. Blickman Engineering, and Blickman with a B, an M, and something else. You can find them on the web. And they have been producing great brewing equipment for a long time, decades now, I think. And they've been a fine sponsor of our show, taking care of the cost of producing this show so you don't have to pay a penny. So if you get a chance, check out Blickman Engineering and tell them we said hi. Our show today is all about the history of American brewing and how that kind of got started, and then, you know, some of the innovations of American brewing over the past. And our guest is none other than Greg Casey. How you doing, Greg?
I'm doing well. How about yourself, Jamil?
I'm hanging in there. It's been a challenge. Running a business during the pandemic has been more challenging than I have enjoyed.
Yeah, our son's dealing with that well here in Colorado in his brewery and tap room, and yeah, it's been a difficult year. Yeah.
Well, there you go. But you know, I think we're starting to come out of it, and we're starting to recover. It's going to be a good year for American brewing, I think. Going forward. So how did you get into researching and studying the history of American brewing?
Yeah, it really occurred towards the end of my career. I was as it says here, cultured in yeast. My passion was yeast, lager yeast. It was a chance meeting with the entourage of August Busch in Copenhagen that led me in 1985, make a long story short, to work for Anheuser-Busch and Stroh and Coors, Molson Coors. But towards the end, I started and I had quality assurance responsibilities, and every QA person is sometime or another is going to face the issue. Is there any caustic left in did we rinse it well? What's, and the old sodium test is, it's not that specific. It's not, without a process capability survey to know what your normal levels are. It's kind of difficult to say yay or nay, especially when you're looking at a plant manager that's looking at you saying, can I release this? And you're the guy making the call. So I was researching to see if there were more contemporary test methods, my ASPC background as well. And in the course of that, I came across a reference. It's called the Turner Adulteration Bill. A Google search can take you down a rabbit hole a lot of different ways. And I didn't think when I clicked on that I'd spend the next 14 years researching the history of the American lager brewing industry, specifically most of that being adjunct lager brewing. So that's what sort of started me on this road. I asked Bill Coors if he had heard of this in the 1890s, that Congress almost outlawed, we almost had an American high school vote. And when Bill said no, he'd never heard of it, I figured, well, nobody has. So, and I love history. You look at my library in the other room, there's no science, it's all history. So it's kind of allowed me to merge a professional background with a passion in retirement that's aligned with my desire to understand better history, particularly of the American lager brewing industry.
It's fascinating. I love old breweries and just kind of it's surprising. I was at Fuller's doing a collab brew with them a while back, and I went and looked in the logbooks for 100 years previous. On that same day 100 years ago, this is what they were brewing.
Yeah.
So cool to me to think that I was part of that little chain of brews that have been made at that brewery for 150 years. I was kind of inserted in that chain, and now I'm in the logbooks, and it's got a life of its own. And
yeah.
Maybe somebody 100 years from now will be looking at that going, oh, what were they brewing? And I'm like, oh my god, they brewed we brewed a blackberry goza.
I bet you they will. I mean, I had a comparable experience with Jackie Marty at August Shell. Mm-hmm. He opened up the old logbooks for me.
Right.
And we had a great time looking at them. And he many of the materials, he wasn't familiar what they were, in terms of pre-gelatinized cornflakes or, these commercial names. Right. Through my research. So it was kind of a wonderful moment where he and I were going back and forth, his heritage, my weaving in some of my findings as to what this was. I just sent him 1884, I believe, a hopjack that August Shell had patented and advertised in Trade Journal. And he, Jackie, he knew of it, but he never seen an ad for it or seen an image of it. So yeah, that's part of our history is fascinating. And it's not just, everybody I work for, Bud Miller Coors. There's all these hundreds, if not thousands of brewers I never heard of, certainly my Canadian background.
It's funny you mentioned August Shell because I've been there, and at the time, they were showing me the Cypress fooders. I think it was Cypress, wasn't it, or was it Spruce? The giant fooders that they were setting up. They hadn't got them up and running yet, and but one of the things I thought was really cool there is they had their own little museum, and they had stuff like, here's the still that Grandpa was using during Prohibition to make some spirits that he could flavor the beer up with, and here's all the axe marks when he thought the feds were going to come and get him, and they I mean, they have all that stuff on hand, and they're not shy about their history. It was really, really, really cool. So what was the beginning of the American brewing scene? How did that start? I mean, what was this?
If before lager, I mean, to me, you talk about fashion coming around full circle. If you go back to from the founding of the country right up to the 1840s, the 1840s, you'd be seeing ales, porter, stouts, India, pale ales advertised, not a lager, right? Because that didn't come over until it came with, they got the yeast in the 1840s to be able to brew the style in the United States. But it was just a fraction of the alcoholic beverage category in the United States. I mean, we were nasty. We drank a lot of hard alcohol, hard whiskey and Madeira and hard ciders and higher alcohol products. And it was just a very small fraction in comparison on a per capita basis. And then when lager came, that's what really, we think of beer as particularly the adjunct lager beer, which is the primary focus as a sort of a national beverage within the alcoholic category. That's when it really started to take off, 1840s to 1870s. It was a Dunkel style all malt Bavarian beer, and that was brewed exclusively. Although we might touch on it later, in the 1860s, they were already brewing well before Anton Schwartz came here, corn brews in various locations across the United States. But then came Pilsner, in 1870s. And that just exploded beer, not just here, but around the world. As a style, Pilsner became a marketing phenom, even in Germany and other places. So, but in here, we had our idiosyncrasies that maybe we'll talk about in a bit, that we wanted it crystal clear and when it was ice cold. in a glass. And now, to me, that reign of adjunct lager beer that really started by the 1880s, 1890s, the vast majority of beers, lager was adjunct, to the point it was almost extinct, or mentioned as being almost extinct in 1908 federal hearings. And then it's continued its reign. It's been chipped away at, obviously, in the last 30 years. I think I joined the American industry at the apex, and then every year I've been here since the late 1980s, it's gone down. That's correlation, not causation, in my opinion. But then now we come full circle, as I mentioned. These ales and porters and stouts and IPAs. I mean, it's wonderful. I mean, I'm so happy and enthused to be alive right now as an American who likes beer. I mean, craft and macro. There's no other place on the planet that I'm aware of, and I've seen a lot of it over the years. It's a better place to be if you like beer. So we've kind of got the two revolutions meeting as one: the Pilsner, the adjunct, with the craft, and they're duking it out, and will be to be determined. But that's still got legs, adjunct lager beer.
Right. You even see, smaller craft brewers. Adjunct lagers. A friend of mine just down the road at True Symmetry, he brews, a rice adjunct lager, fairly frequently.
I'm really delighted. I've been in, since some of the MBA papers came out. I'll leave them anonymous, but I've been contacted about rice, where to get it, the history, sending them papers, written in ET100s by American brewers, brewing scientists about the use of rice, part of the heritage. That is part of our American heritage for sure. And I'm really delighted to see, 14 years is a long time, especially in today's world, right? When I look back in 2007-ish, sort of adjuncts for Verboten, to see the resurgence, and even in some cases of corn, in various parts of the country, because it is part of our heritage. It's part of our history. And, craft beer, if I'm learning from my son, it's about anything. It's about heritage and history and styles. Well, that's part of our American history and our journey as a nation in brewing.
Right. Let's do this. Let's take a short break. And when we come back, we'll hear more about American brewing history right after this.
Hey, it's Kaylee Cuoco for Priceline. Ready to go to your happy place for a happy price? Well, why didn't you say so? Just download the Priceline app right now and save up to 60% on hotels. So whether it's Cousin Kevin's Kazoo Concert in Kansas City, go Kevin, or Becky's Bachelorette Bash in Bermuda, you never have to miss a trip ever again. So download the Priceline app today. Your savings are waiting.
Go to your happy place for a happy price. Go to your happy price, Priceline.
Are you looking for a simple brewing system that's great for all grain brewing, but everything on the market seems to be full of compromises? Blickman Engineering has the answer. The Blickman Brew Easy All Grain Brewing System. The Brew Easy is a complete system with easy upgrades and a beautiful compact design, perfect for any size brewing location. At its core, the Brew Easy is built on two gorgeous Blickman Boilermaker brew kettles, a high-temperature March pump, and either a top-tier gas burner or the new Boil Coil electric heater. The Brew Easy adapter lid allows the pots to stack on top of each other, forming an efficient, strong, and compact brewing setup that comes in 5, 10, and 20-gallon batch sizes. Upgrade your Brew Easy system with full automated control by adding a Blickman Tower of Power temp controller, and make moving around easy with the Blickman Kettle Cart. The Brew Easy is modular. If you already own a Boilermaker kettle, you can build your Brew Easy by purchasing just the modules you need. The new Brew Easy all-grain brewing system. See it today at BlickmanEngineering.com and brew with Blickman quality on your new Brew Easy.
Back to the two guys that know how to turn beer into beer. This is Brew Strong.
All right, we're back talking with John Casey about the history of American adjunct lager brewing. And so, you mentioned, when lager first came to the U.S. and it started being brewed in the U.S., 1840s, did you say? I mean,
yeah,
I've always heard stories that, some German brewer got a brick of yeast from, pressed all the moisture out of a brick of yeast back in Germany, tucked it in his shirt and brought it over. And that's how it kicked off here. Is that true or?
Well, true is a powerful word because that requires facts. And much of that period, the late 1830s, right up to 1842, depending on the author and the source, I mean, you could see various explanations for how the yeast arrived here. I look at, when Best, eventually became Frederick's Pabst Brewery, there's good documentation there that it came over in a barrel of sawdust. And, that was sort of a desiccant, if you will, and was able to revive enough yeast to eventually make a lager beer with repitching as they had concentrated the lager yeast over the indigenous wild yeast. But I've heard it in loaves of bread, for example. There's always some kind of a desiccant material. I mean, yeast was a product in German breweries at the time, so they were well accustomed to, putting it in a way that it could be transported and used elsewhere. But to me, there is no definitive answer both to the exact date and location. You'll see Frederick Lauer in Reading, Pennsylvania, for example, as being frequently, if you Google search, but Frederick Lauer personally said, no, it wasn't me, and he lived a long life, and he gave credit to a guy named Wagner. So, and then you get all these other claims of being the first to brew lager beer, but it's safe to say that it was started by 1840, 1842, but it was a beer brewed by Germans for Germans. I mean, it was, there was the stigma of, America, well, they weren't too hard on this Canadian, immigrating to the United States. Every group kind of takes its shots, and the Germans, the Dutch, the Deutsch, the Dutchmen, Deutsch, Dutch, Dutchman. I mean, it was considered a beer of them. And you really see this progression in the 1870s, 1880s, where they, even in the media, they say all Americans, like this style of beer. And that's when lager really took off. But 1840s.
And when did adjunct lager take off? And what was the transition from, the all malt German beer to adjuncts? Or were they using adjuncts in Germany at the time?
That was Pilsner. Pilsner, in the 1870s, Pilsner really, really became a global phenomenon. And in the United States, when you look at cultural differences, I guess, between Americans and how, again, we got to go back 150 years, right? And many of these idiosyncrasies are still true today. But if you look back, I mean, Americans, we like our beer cold. Many, still to this day, we drink it colder than most of the world. We drink it relatively quickly. We don't linger in beer gardens and quaff it, and we certainly don't look at it as a form of nutrition. We look at it as a form of refreshment. And all these things that were cultural norms in the United States, but not relevant in the German market. A German consumer didn't really care about most of these attributes. They didn't even see the beer by and large in the 1870s and 80s. They were drinking out of stone steins. And there's a wonderful quote from the head brewer at Schaefer in the late 1800s. Germans drink beer with their tongues. Americans drink beer with their eyes. And that's so true. And that profoundly impacted how the style evolved in the United States. In the second paper, as John, as MBA editor, is well familiar with, and the MBA, they were using adjuncts in Germany for the same purposes, but not nearly to the same extent as eventually it evolved in the United States. And we know from transcripts in the 1880s, 90s, 1900s, 1910s, a lot of them arrived in the United States already versed from brewing in Germany with rice in particular as an adjunct. But it was a perfect, to get to 30, 40% adjunct, which was much higher than any adjunct records I find in Germany. That was the combination of 6-row, which is higher in protein, for example, and chill haze potential, and to dilute it out with 30, 40% adjunct became a quintessential American style of beer. And indeed, now 150 years later, you could say it's quintessentially the world's beer. You can always get, no matter where you go, you can always find an adjunct lager beer brewed by some brewery in that continent. So it began in Germany, as I talk about, and terribly biased, though it was perfected in America especially with the Tuborg type yeast, but that's a whole other story.
Well, do you have any idea of why the Germans started brewing with adjunct? I mean, what was the impetus there?
That's a really good question. I suspect, when Germany became, you get studying German history, the German Empire, they call it the Second Reich. We all know what the third one was, right? Well, the Second Reich was the 1871, 1872 to the fall at the Weimar Republic in 1919 and the end of World War I in 1918. It was the reason the German tax code, the Reichstag imposed, when you search the records, there's taxes for malt, rice, sugars, syrups, all these adjunct materials, because prior to 1871 and 1872, when the Reichstag implemented this, they were free to use these other materials without paying tax. It was only malt that was taxed. Kind of like it is in Bavaria, right?
So it all comes back to money.
Follow money. That's my belief. I can't say a German said this in this transcript, but I do know from the Reichstag transcripts that the only reason they were added, not Bavaria, of course, just all malt, but for the rest of Germany, which is the vast majority of the population in an area, especially then when the empire was quite a bit bigger than it is today, they added those as categories because they weren't getting tax money. But then, you look at that and you try to qualify that, because there are credible references in the United States that demonstrate, particularly in the 1870s and 1880s, on an extract basis, rice was more expensive. And they were charging higher, as crazy as this sounds, in New York City during parts of the 1880s, more for an adjunct lager than they were for an all malt lager, because it cost them more. That's obviously that has changed over the last century and a half, particularly with liquid adjuncts, and it's certainly much less expensive to brew with adjuncts than it is all malt. But back then, when it was born, when it was being nurtured, when it was being rolled out there, and the brewers were being told, take back your all malt beer, this one sells, this one doesn't. Those kind of anecdotes are easily found in hearings and testimonies and newspaper and trade journal interviews. It was a novelty that the American industry perfected to be crystal clear when it was ice cold. And that, some of the first memories of some very prominent brewing scientists was coming to, well before Statue of Liberty was there, but coming into New York Harbor and seeing signs for dyspepsia or, stomach conditions from drinking ice water, and they write that, Dr. Max Hennius, his father was aquavit in Denmark. Anyhow, it was one of his first memories was seeing signs for Americans ailing from drinking too much cold ice water, so it was kind of an idiosyncrasy that still, I think, Americans and our ice, it's kind of our DNA.
Fascinating. I cannot live without ice. And
I know.
One of the things, the zombie apocalypse comes, and I've made this very clear. I'm moving north to where I can find ice like on the ground. I'm not hanging around where there's no ice.
I got to warn you, Canadians are partial to being used for hockey, not consumption. So you might have a bit of a fight on your hand there, but I can translate for you.
That, or I'll start generating my own power so I can run an ice maker.
There you go.
What I would start with.
Yeah, but even a silly thing, and John, I mentioned this, when we moved to St. Louis in 1987, that's the first time in my life I ever saw an ice dispenser in the front of a refrigerator. That's 1987. That's not that. Canadians don't have that. We had those plastic ice cubes that you crack, and there wasn't a refrigerator I've seen in my life that you just put your glass in, and lo and behold, chunks of ice fall out. My kids and I were fascinated by that. Like, holy smolies, these Americans, they are different. But it's just those little things that point to a nation's culture, its history, its unique interests and habits.
It is fascinating. So what year are we in right now? We're kind of moved up into 1870. Adjunct lager has taken hold in the United States. Anton Schwartz has been evangelizing about it, as well as other people such as Ludwig Hocker. I guess tell a little bit more about the adoption of adjunct lager into the breweries. I guess, moving from 1870 up to 1890.
Okay. Yeah. And that really is, when I look back over the last 14 years, that window of time, from the 1870s right up to Prohibition, but mostly those last decades of the 19th century, was the controversy in the United States over the use of malt substitutes.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a big deal. And every single force in American society that had power, whether it was the Supreme Court, whether it was federal government, state governments, local governments, whatever, they all took their shots at telling these uppity German American immigrants to brew all malt beer. And they would, the irony of having in literally in Senate hearings in Washington, D.C., having, Germans defend the practice of using adjuncts because you Americans seem to prefer it. They don't say it makes more money for them, but that's obviously between. But it's that period is remarkable because that's where on a per capita basis, we got close by the end of the 19th century to the highest per capita for beer that we would not see again until the 1970s, and yet this occurred in an environment where every institution said no. I mean, it started 1860s, for example. You mentioned Ludwig Hacker. He came over, he spent all of 1863 with his patent on the use of Indian corn. Pardon my, wasn't what they called it then. But he went around virtually all of the United States, North and South, during the height of the Civil War. And he writes his chronicles. He wrote them a few years later, saying he was ran out of Indiana when they got wind he was going to do a test brew of his corn, and the townspeople got together and ran him out of town. You're not going to mess with my all malt beer. He met brewers in Louisville, Kentucky, who said, "Yeah, we've been using corn for about 10 years. We don't tell anybody." So it was kind of there's plenty of information and archival research to show that, we were using corn in the 1860s, sort of before it exploded in the 1870s. But yeah, it was just because every brewery, and to this day, and, as far as I'd never owned a brewery, but 1862, they had to keep track and report to the federal government every pound of every material used to brew beer in that brewery and report it to the federal government. It was called internal revenue then, and it played a large role in funding the beer tax. Played a large role in funding the victory of the Union during the Civil War. But dutifully every month those materials were reported. In the 1870s, newspaper reporters could just go into the internal revenue and ask for the data, and that's when the proverbial SH hit the fan in cities from Milwaukee, Cincinnati, St. Louis, New York City, for example, because diligent reporters could get that information. And the outrage, and it started there sort of with the media being outraged by the use of malt substitutes. And then it kind of cascaded up through the powerful levels within American society, local governments, state governments, federal governments. And it's just a surreal struggle, which is the heart and soul of much of the later volumes of books. We'll maybe talk about that later. Mm-hmm. But it's an inspiring story to me because, they fought very hard to protect our rights to brew materials of our choice.
Yeah.
And, to think that what would have happened if that hadn't happened is kind of like, in a beer sense, very, very profound. But yeah, so even despite this, 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, and right up to just for the Prohibition, this beer exploded and was the public was very aware, in terms of the use of corn and rice to make this beer. And, and it didn't stop the powers that be that, by and large, were, overwhelmingly Anglo-Saxon in their heritage, if you will. And they thought we know better. And the Germans, as I mentioned, German Americans were saying, no, they want to ban wheat, for example, and they'd patiently tell McKinley, future president assassinated in Buffalo, that wheat's used to make style beer in Berlin. It's a normal material used in Germany. So you read these transcripts and it's just like, it's kind of a crazy. So that's the societal debate. And, the first use of the Smithsonian in DC were the beer hearings in first week of August, 1911, because there were so many parties that wanted to have a say. Should malt substitutes be banned? Should we have an American Reinheitsgebot? They didn't call it that word because that didn't happen until much later in terms of general use. but they were very well aware that Germany had gone that way in 1906, and they're ready to go, even despite all these decades. 1890, they started the federal to 1911. They want to have an American High School, but then lawyers, of all things, said, no, you don't have the mandate for that. You can't set the standard, so we evaded an American Rhine High School vote at that time.
Yeah. So there's so many different organizations pushing for all malt beer. You had the barley farmers, you had the maltsters, you had, I guess you almost call them grassroots organizations fighting for food purity, cross-country transportation of meat and refrigeration was big at the time. And so, there's a lot of concern about food spoilage, and I guess maybe that colored these perceptions of beer and malt substitutes. Would you say?
Yeah, that's a great point, John. That definitely, if I had a penny or a dime for every time the word adulterated, and the FDA, we call it the FDA now, but the Food and Drug Act of the Pure Food Congress, which it was called in the late 1800s, gave the founding of the modern FDA in 1906. And there's absolutely no question American society needed that. Food and beverage, things were killing people. There was a lot of soldiers in Cuba in the Spanish-American War, 1898, that died of toxicity, from contaminated food. Oh. So the government, the people, society knew we needed to do something in terms of establishing standards. And that definitely, particularly when we got into the 1890s and right up to that 1911, 1912 period, that theme of pure food, adulterating, being used as a basis to say this is why we need all malt beer, definitely factored in. 1890, it was transparent. The transcripts, that turn adulteration that started this, the first question, Jamil, they read it, which stopped the Rhine High School being imposed then, was they read into the transcripts, the brewers did, because many of them were maltsters as well. Back then, most brewers malted their own malt, their own barley to make malt. They read into the transcripts, you can read them, in the Library of Congress, special interest groups advocating to say, we will agitate on behalf of banning the use of malt substitutes. These are lawyers in DC, lobbyists. You send us this amount of money, we will start to agitate. And that was really the death blow to the legislation. That one, 1890, they didn't weave in pure food or whatever. That kind of came later. But the one where they didn't beat around the bush was 1890. But even 1911 at the Smithsonian hearings, the maltsters were open in saying it would be good for the American barley farmers if we didn't use rice, because that was preferred for many. And let's not forget, this was not that long after the Civil War, right? And in New York State, for example, there were frequent references to, we don't grow rice in New York. Why would we use it? Why don't we ban it? It's not good for our farmers, and helping out southern states probably wasn't high on their priority list. So it was an interesting time with different aspects of history, but that's a long-winded way of saying to your question, John. Yeah, that adulteration was used, but there was never, to the best of my knowledge, and I've looked extensively, never a documented case of anyone getting sick from drinking an adulterated beer in the United States. They certainly did in England, arsenic poisoning, 1901-ish, I think, with the coal used and generate the sulfuric acid for production of glucose was contaminated with arsenic. A lot of people died. And that kind of they were aware of that. That made its way into New York papers. Hey, look what's happening in England. Hundreds of people are dying from drinking beer with liquid adjuncts. They didn't call it that, but they called it glucose and grape sugar. And so, that was on people's minds for sure. But they still kept drinking it. It just
maybe this one won't kill me. So I'll try this one. Let's take another short break. When we come back, we'll hear more of the fascinating history of American lagers after this.
Learning to brew has never been so disgusting. This is Brew Strong.
All right, we're back. Just want to tell you about our good friends at Brew Chatter in Sparks, Nevada. Right up near Reno. If you're deciding on making a lager of any kind or any kind of beer in your home brewery, they have all the goods for you. They got the yeast. They've got, if you want to use rice, they've got that too. If you want to make yourself a pre-prohibition lager, they could tell you how to do it and make a great one at that. So check them out, brewchatter.com. Tell RJ and Josh that we sent you, and they'll take good care of you. All right. So before the break, you just told us about, hundreds of people dying in England from the glucose that was made and got contaminated with arsenic and killed a bunch of people, but they kept on drinking beer anyways. Seems like the plucky British spirit to just keep soldiering on, regardless of the problem.
Yeah, I guess that was nothing compared to Hitler a few decades later. But yeah, stiff upper lip, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Is that an effect of the arsenic? Maybe stiff upper lip.
I don't know. The limey, of course, was the fruit to ward off scurvy, the vitamin C. But what about arsenic and the stiff upper lip? But I guess was not. And there was something in Canada too in the 1950s where some people got some pretty sick in Quebec, but I can't remember what the root cause. But anyhow, there are many, many claims made, particularly in the papers, that American brewers were using hop substitutes, and many of which were obviously quite toxic. It didn't make any sense. They wouldn't be making that and drinking it themselves with their own families. But many, many claims made that dangerous substitutes were being used in the United States. Not once have I seen any of that validated, with the exception if you want to consider salicylic acid, which was a preservative used. We don't use it today. And I'm still.
Isn't that the stuff used in heat rub?
Is it? I don't know. To look. Salicylic acid.
Aspirin.
It was used in both in Germany. Your Germans were using it for export to preserve the beer, to give it a chance of arriving non-turbid. But it was also used. Some of that was used in American breweries because it was kind of common around the world, particularly for export beer.
I mean, isn't salicylic acid? Isn't it baby aspirin?
I think it's got Bayer aspirin,
which
it's got linkage to it's got linkage to that, and Bayer makes it as the patent. So there's your answer. So, but they were doing studies in France and England, United States, and Germany on what does it take to make you sick with salicylic acid, and it was way above whatever you'd get in a glass of beer. But that's the only, and that's
now people consume it.
Yeah, that's tangential. I mean, you could never drink enough beer to get anyhow. But all these claims were made, but never proven.
Yeah, so I guess the purity of beer was a common issue, and the definition of what is beer.
Yeah, and that that those three words, what is beer? ? 3 words with a question mark, dominated headlines leading up to World War I. When I looked at you go to newspapers.com and referring to the hearings at the Smithsonian in letters as big as when we went to war in Spain in 1898 on the front page, what is beer? ? I mean, it seems bizarre to think of it today, but back then, because the only way of getting news was the media, the newspapers, of course, back then. It was a huge issue. And it was a huge issue in American society, beginning with those newspaper reporters in the 1870s, culminating really right up until then. And there were many casualties. The pure food, if you will, was used, for example, by the state of Missouri. They banned, and there's a really fascinating story of this guy by the name of, he called himself General Bill Ryder, but his nickname was Pure Beer Ryder. And he had introduced pure beer bills into Jefferson City almost on a yearly basis, beginning in the late 1870s, to ban the use of corn and rice. Well, fast forward to 1899, the Missouri legislature decided they would ban any beer made in the state of Missouri or passing through the state of Missouri that contained corn. And I know you're thinking, it sounds like Anheuser-Busch doing. No, it wasn't. I mean, this really wasn't. This was the farmers of the state using this pure beer rider as a lobbyist to get this bill passed so they could build macadamized roads for bicycles in rural Missouri. I mean, it was in the legislature. It was blatantly said this: we will inspect beer, but there was no test to test beer that I'm not aware of today. You can say it has corn or rice or whatever, but it was basically just a charge on the local brewing and anybody that was passing beer through the state of Missouri. And Fred Pabst in Milwaukee, and I love this because the St. Louis Post-Dispatch says the foreign brewer Frederick Pabst. I mean, you got to get, again, this is 1890.
American born and raised.
Was, I get United States of America as a naturalized citizen. They took this seriously. It is, I thought it was somebody in Belgium or Holland or Germany, but it was Milwaukee, Wisconsin was foreign. But he sued the state of Missouri and went all the way up through each of the levels of the courts and went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court agreed with the state of Missouri, saying it was a food safety, to your long-winded question here, that they had the right to inspect it from a food inspection, and it was a food inspection law, even though there was no testing they did on the samples. There's no way of validating what they were doing, and they acknowledged read the transcripts in the legislature, it was purely a revenue-raising method for the lobbyists to get these roads in rural Missouri. They didn't hide it, that it was a revenue generating, but it was actually passed as a food inspection and safety. So Fred Pabst lost. And interesting, in terms of the Jim Crow mentions nowadays, Justice Brown on Supreme Court was the one that ruled for dissent. He was with Fred Pabst on this one. He didn't get things right on some other things, but on that one, he was with Fred Pabst, but Fred lost. It was won by a close vote. There's no document. They couldn't inspect. There's no way of testing for corn that I know of. Certainly not in 1899 and right up to the First World War. We did have a period, an unofficial American Reinheitsgebot. Did you know that?
No, I didn't.
The last 2 months before Prohibition, future President Hoover, who was Food Administrator Hoover, 1918, forbid American breweries to use any malt substitutes, corn, rice, in anticipation of Belgian famine relief. And this may be a segue to World War II, but for 2 months, American brewers were forced to brew only all malt beer. And you see American headlines, newspapers saying, the best beer to be the last beer to be the best. Finally, all malt, but it wasn't passed under an FTA. It was passed on the need to preserve food grains for anticipated food shortages, particularly in Belgium, and for the last 2 months. And it's a riot to read the trade journals like, oh my God, we got to make an all malt beer. How do we make it the way, to taste like and look like and be like the national beverage? And I know from personal experience, I'll leave the brewery unnamed, but we tried to make a very popular brand of light beer in America today with all malt. We couldn't do it. And I think we had some of the best minds and chemists and microbiologists in the century. But it was kind of interesting to read the panic, which seems counterintuitive, right? Oh, all malt? Oh, no. But that's what it was. And then Prohibition came and made it all moot, of course. But we did have it. And we did have it for 2 months.
And how did the World War I, World War II affect American brewing?
Oh, that's great. That's a really good question. Segueing from that World War I, Prohibition, 1919 and 1933. And we just had April 7th, right? In terms of Celebrate Beer Day, that's when President Roosevelt said 3-2 beer wasn't intoxicating. It was legal. And then in December of the same year, 1933, beer became, with the exception of local idiosyncrasies, modern sort of beer in terms of alcohol content for lager. And we can talk about this in some of the books perhaps later, but the Americans have been kind of accustomed to a heavier, sweeter, non-alcoholic beverages from 1919 right up to 1933. And when beer came back online, when you look at the average materials used in a barrel of beer from 34, right up to the First World War, was actually some of the heaviest lager in terms of, skewed higher malt, less adjunct than had been in the 1890s or even 1910s. So I attribute that to the euphoria of brewers being brewers. If we're going to make beer after 20 years, I'm going to make the beer I like. But then you see this plateau, and then it dropped, going in from 1936, 37, 38. You would think that would have continued to rise because it was only, production and per capita. It wasn't just, one or the other, it was both. It peaked in the late 1930s and it started to decline. Then all of a sudden, World War II comes and boom, it went from 50 million barrels roughly to almost 90 million barrels over a five. I mean, you think of that in terms of modern percent. If we're 200 million today, you think of that in 7 years. I mean, every craft brewer in macro will be salivating in the extreme over growing so much.
Was that because the beer was being shipped overseas for the war effort, or was it because people were like, well, there's a war on, so I might as well drink? It's like a pandemic thing where the pandemic comes and people just like started drinking more.
Well, that's a great question, Joe, because I think it's kind of like, was the Ryan High School vote passed in 1915, 16 for quality or for safety or for, protect, there's a billion reasons that are thrown out there as to why. In this first book that's coming out with the MBA, we talk about, well, why in the heck did American beer explode to the degree that it did? Was it thirsty troops in the Pacific Islands? And, was it people had more money in their pocket because, with the Depression past and the American economy on hormones, was it driven by that? Or was it driven, and this is what I argue, both in the MBA papers and in the first volume in this series of books with the MBA, that was the beer. And it ties in so nicely, I believe, to so many of the myths associated with the use of adjuncts. When did, adjunct lager beer take off in the United States? You can still find it in the book, show countless examples of it started in World War II, when malt was hard to come by and brewers started to use corn rice, 41, 45, and kept using it because it was a profit-saving measure, right? I mean, that's right. Sort of paradigm. It's been disproven by Maureen Ogle and other authors for sure. We've talked at length here about the use of adjuncts from 1870s right up to 1940. So it really didn't start there. But the interesting part was during the war, the only material of the traditional brewing materials, by then traditional in America meant malt, rice, corn as the main grains, right? The most difficult materials to get were rice and particularly corn during the war, because there were so many applications for corn and corn starch and corn products for military needs that the preferred sources of refined starch, flaked starch, for example, just disappeared. I mean, the military got priority for those. Malt was kept virtually unchanged at the level it was when the United States entered the war. So throughout 1941, 1945, with the exception almost to the last few months of the war, malt was almost 100% what it was in 1941. But yet we went from like 50 to 90, right? The fixed malt, so something had to give, right? You're not gonna, and that's when the industry exploded with the use of non-traditional but period-specific malt substitutes, raw barley, particularly, and the sorghum grains, Kaffir corn and Milo maize. Milo or Milo maize? I don't know. I've never figured out which. I don't know. So anyhow, let's just say sorghum grains and soybean flakes from 1943 is when we first had that, when the United States really ramped up militarily and corn just disappeared from the market. And we started using in the hundreds of millions of pounds, as replacements for corn, in particular, things like sorghum grains and barley grits. Rahr came up with barley grits, and Frater came up with a pre-gelatinized barley flakes, but it was raw, just different forms for use, depending on what the brew house capabilities were. And then came 1945 to 48, when the United States was basically the world's breadbasket, world's kitchen. When you think of all of the supply chains shot to heck in Asia and Europe, the world needed to be fed to avoid global famine, global instability, particularly in the period after the war. In the United States, along with Canada, New Zealand, Australia in particular, provided food aid to especially Western Europe to be able, and included in those were sorghum grains, which I just mentioned for use in the war. Those are foods too. So the irony is this growth, this 50 to 90 that took place in 41 to 49, much of it took place in 45 to 49 when sorghum grains, corn, rice, all these others were going to feed people. And from 45 to 49, you see the use of cassava from South America exploding in use. And I've been in touch with you on that, John. And again, these are in the tens of millions and cumulatively hundreds of millions of pounds as substitutes for these traditional malt substitutes. So in that period, from about 43 to 45, 46, you see adjunct, the ratio of adjuncts to malt actually creep above malt. We were using, and that window there is when the growth exploded, in terms of the most rapid growth. The lightest beer correlates, and that's the debate, is it causation or correlation to particularly the highest use of adjuncts that had been done to that point in the style's history, beginning as long back as the 1870s. But then after the war, because malt wasn't a food, so brewers did have malt after the war. It's just adjuncts, ironically, per the myths, they start to use adjuncts the adjuncts were the hardest to get after the war. Malt went right back to normal right away. They didn't need it to make bombs and everything else. So it's a fast, then it started to decline again. It hit these and it wouldn't hit these, exceed these numbers reached during the war years with the lightest beer. Keep that in mind. It was truly the lightest beer until the directed development of the modern light lager, and that's in the 1970s and early 80s, with Bud Light, Coors Light, and Miller Lite, and the rest. Only then did we surpass the peak industry volumes of the years just prior to Prohibition in both per capita and actual production. So I see these two flowerings, if you will, in the industry in my parents' lifetime, my grandparents' lifetime, where it exploded when it was particularly light during the war. It kind of went flat. Yeah, you got the boomers, they changed everything and statistics start to go up, but then they, with the evolution of adjunct lager beer in the modern light lager, that's when we saw it explode again to highs that, reached there in the late 1980s I talked about, but then have been declining nationally in terms of domestically brewed beer.
One more short break, and then we'll come back and wrap up talking about the history of American lager and adjuncts' impact on it. We'll be back right after this.
Back to the beer guys that make other beer guys look like wine guys. Brew strong.
All right, we're back.
Got a fair number of questions in the chat too.
Oh, okay.
There's quite a variety, and I hate to interrupt, but interesting one here. I've heard of pre-prohibition Weiss beer brewed in the United States with corn grits instead of wheat. Were Americans using Weissen yeast back then? Any knowledge on that, Greg?
All I can say with certainty is I was surprised just how prevalent Weiss beer was in the United States in the 19th century. You look at the New York City directory, for example, many brewers whose trademark was they brewed that style of beer. And I wouldn't be surprised. Again, unless I have definitive evidence, I can't say yes, but I know wheat malt was used interchangeably in ales with malted corn, for example. So it wouldn't surprise me if it was, although I don't have a specific brewery that I could say they did that. But wheat beer, Weiss beer, was very, very, I was surprised. I thought it was kind of came to the United States with the craft movement, but no, it came equally with the German wave in the 1840s, 50s, and the 19th century. And that style of beer was very popular in the United States, totally disappeared by the Second World War. And, my lifetime, and was been, at least in the United States, been revived by the American craft movement.
Okay. Here's another one. Joanne asks if she's curious if Yuengling brewed something in the 1820s different than their lager?
Well, they go back. So they, I believe, and I'm probably this one, if I went back in my archives downstairs, in terms of ales and porters and, non-lager beers. Yes, they certainly did. Yuengling became, now it's the oldest brewery in the United States. Lagers are predominant. But one of his sons, set up the David G. Yuengling Brewery in New York City, and he was brewing adjunct lager beer. When I was with Stroh, I know from all the formulations, as we brewed every one of Yuengling's brands in Lehigh, I know it's in there. So I wasn't surprised, let's say, that David Yuengling in New York City signed that manifesto saying this is how lager beer is made in the United States. We use corn, rice, and sugar and syrups, but he was one of the signees to that. So I noticed that name, Yuengling. I went, interesting. Yeah. But he was quite a cad. Anyhow, hope that answers the question. Yeah, they were pre-lager for sure.
Okay. And then Kurt asks an interesting question. Discuss history of the six-pack. And I guess this is a little outside of this discussion, but any ideas when the concept of the six-pack arrived?
Isn't the story that they decided on a six-pack because that's all that women were able to carry, they figured, or something? Haven't you heard that story?
I've heard that story. All I could say was from the 1840s to 1940s, I don't see any mention of a six-pack. I do see in the 1930s, for example, the light weighting of getting away from wood, in terms of the carton and going to fiberboard. That was highly, highly promoted in the 1930s with, Natalie Jess women with their feathers and the hats and everything, walking into a Studebaker or whatever the car was, carrying a 24-pack of beer because it was light. That, the implication there was so light, even a spouse or housewife, but again, you got to remember the time this was, could use it. So the light weighting, was also applicable to the packaging materials as it was to the beer. But I don't see any memory. I don't see anything about six-pack carriers in my research. I haven't come across it. So that in and of itself says it was a post-1940s.
Makes sense. Yep. Okay. Well, it's probably about all the time we have on this show.
Yeah. Well, let's do this. Greg, if you can stay with us and do another episode, we'd love to have you. I know there's a lot of fascinating things that you've come across over the years, the last 14 years that you could tell us about. So if you're listening live, stay tuned. We'll have another episode coming up right after this. If you are listening on the podcast, then it's going to be about another 2 weeks, and you'll see this show, the next show posted. Until then, make sure that you're check out our fine sponsors, Blickman Engineering, blickmanengineering.com. Good folks there. Send a nice email to John Blickman, feedback at Blickman Engineering. Tell him how much you appreciate that he's paid for the show for the last 15 years, so you don't have to. And our new sponsor, Brew Chatter, RJ and Josh, check them out. Good folks up there. And matter of fact, I'm going to be up there May 1st for Big Brew Day. We're going to brew Tasty IPA and Janet's Brown up there May 1st. So there you go. That'll be fun. All right. Until then, everybody, brew strong.
Brew strong, everyone.